critical aspect of how much capacity the child will have is the same as within your car. If we don't fuel it for what we do, then it's going to break down. So my question would be, does your child eat enough for the amount of sport that they do? Do you ever consider that how much they might do on each day might differ, and therefore the amount of fuel that you give them might differ? So how many children do you think don't eat breakfast? Importantly, does your child eat breakfast? Because this is one of the most important meals of the day. They won't have eaten for maybe up to 12 or 13 hours from the night before. So sending them to school without any fuel is likely to lead to poorer concentration, but also create a spike in injury risk. And so they need to eat the right fuel at the right time. And for children with small tummies, that's little and often. And we can find ourselves, if we are in this negative energy balance where we're not eating enough for what we do, having something called low energy availability. What we put in isn't enough for what we do. And so effectively, we may be firing not fully on empty, but just not on adequate energy for really good performance and for maintenance of wellness. So we can get either unintentional or intentional low energy availability. And the unintentionals are very much around perhaps a parent doesn't realize just how much energy a growing young athlete might need, particularly the boys as they're going through those growth spurts. And we know that playing high intensity sport needs more energy than perhaps some lower intensity or lower volume sports. And certainly in vegan children or children who maybe have to miss out on food groups due to things like lactose intolerance, and even just school meals can end up meaning that children just don't get enough during the course of a school day to fuel them for what they do. And that may be combined with children who are fussy. Perhaps certain children don't like certain textures of food, or they don't like certain maybe they've chosen to miss out certain foods because they don't like them. There's so many reasons why unintentionally the child might not get enough for what they do. But sadly, there are also children who intentionally have a lower energy intake than others, and perhaps than they might need. And this can be for a broad number of reasons, from weight categories that we see in things like boxing or the martial arts or rowing, where children, and in horse racing we sometimes see it as well, where these athletes have to make certain weight categories, and there's a temptation then for them to end up fasting or perhaps not taking on the fluid that they need. And there's been all sorts of fairly poor practices across junior athletics and sport in the past, and hopefully most of this now has been highlighted and eradicated. But it's worth being aware that maybe a more old-fashioned coach might still have some practices that aren't healthy and could put the child at risk of injury by trying to encourage them to meet certain weight categories. And then we can see that different sports have used things like weighing and caliper testing to see how much fat the child's got, with a view that perhaps traditional beliefs were that in certain sports like running, maybe it was thought that being lighter was faster. But that just doesn't stack up. It's not faster to have low energy intake. You won't get the muscle build-up. You won't have the energy to run fast. So we've hopefully eradicated many of these beliefs, but still some coaches will persist in fat shaming children and causing really unhealthy relationships with food. And again, a lot of the governing bodies are really working hard now to minimize the chances of a child being weighed in public or any of these different body tests that can be done. So hopefully you shouldn't get any experience of that. But if you do witness it, it's certainly worth discussing it with the coach, because we don't want these children to get a poor relationship with food. And then you've got those that perhaps are like your gymnastics, or I think Tom Daly's talked about it in diving, whereby children feel they've got to be a certain shape or a certain size or a certain weight. And it's incredibly important that parents have very sensitive discussions with their children about this, and make sure that they avoid any even teasing. Girls, when they go through their puberty, will tend to put on quite a lot of weight before they then lose that over the next 6 to 12 months. But it's massively important that you realize this is just a part of normal hormonal development and is needed to fuel bone health and muscles. So it's not something we should be worried about in these young athletes. So there's all sorts of peer pressures, coach pressures, social pressures. There's the whole social media things of the type of pictures and images they're being exposed to, but also what they put on their social media feed. And we've got to make sure that children understand, in order to perform well, to stay injury free and to stay well, they need to make sure that they're getting adequate energy for what they do. And this can really manifest itself if the body doesn't get enough for what it does, then effectively it will go into fight, fright, flight. So just consider for a moment, when this lion is about to chase these zebras, what systems does the zebra need in order to survive? So when we're threatened with danger, we're threatened with stress, the body's got an incredible coping strategy. It can divert energy to where it needs it. But importantly, if it doesn't think it's got enough energy for what it needs, it's got all sorts of strategies in place to make sure that the essential systems are supported. So if we think for a second about when this zebra needs to run away, it needs its heart, it needs its lungs, it needs its muscles and its senses. But does it need to digest its breakfast? Does it need to reproduce? Does it need to lick its wounds and boost its immunity and do all those growing of muscles to make them stronger? Well, no, it doesn't. So effectively what happens is that the energy gets diverted to where it's needed most. So that's the heart and the lungs and the muscles. But it starts to divert the energy away from things like digestion and repair and immunity and reproduction. And that can create a massive cascade of hormonal responses, which ultimately can lead to injury. And how I describe this is rather like a phone going into power saving mode. We know that when the battery is drained, the phone doesn't work optimally. And so we can explain this to children, that when their phone is in power saving mode, it makes certain decisions for you about where to allocate that last 10% of battery. And it will make sure that you can still make phone calls. It will make sure that you can still text, but it won't allow you to play on games or videos. And so effectively, it saves the energy for what it needs most. And that is exactly how the body works. And when we start to see either short periods or even chronic periods of low energy availability, the impacts on so many different systems is immense. We start to see that our bones become more vulnerable to stress fractures. We can start to get recurrent infections. Our cardiovascular health and our reproductive function over a longer period of time can be adversely affected, and this can affect us for life. And certainly we can start to see changes in mental health. In the boys, we start to see low libido, and their motivation may drop for a sport that they've previously loved. Their sleep quality may get affected, and they start to have that lack of concentration. But critically, they get a drop in performance. So let's just think about what would happen if we noticed a drop in performance. As a parent, what might you do if your child suddenly stops performing as well as they were? Perhaps in something like a swimmer, we might see that they're not reaching their personal bests. Perhaps you can just see observably that they're not doing as well as they were. And there's many reasons for this. But the problem is that if the child sees that they're not performing as well, maybe they just try harder. Maybe the parent adds some extra coaching sessions in for them. So let's just think for a second about these blue, in the top diagram there, these blue rectangular units. And think of those as maybe a swim or a run, or for yourself, a gym activity. And what we would expect is if we do more sport, we'll get fitter. But the only way that will occur is if we get adequate recovery. And that red line is equivalent to our recovery periods. So think of that dotted horizontal line as like our baseline of fitness. We do a unit of sport, and providing we get that red line recovery that goes above our previous baseline level, we get a little bit fitter. And then we do another unit of sport, and provided we get that recovery, there's a gradual increase in fitness occurring. You can see that other blue line steadily climbing. But unfortunately, what can happen if we start ramming more sessions together, we try harder, and maybe we're still not getting adequate fuel for what we do? And then what happens is the recovery never quite has time to get back to baseline. And so we start on this slippery slope, this yellow line, where we're getting a downturn in fitness, a downturn in performance, and ultimately this vicious cycle where they keep trying harder, but without recovery and without the adequate fuel, they just start getting less and less able to perform. And the increase in injury risk and illness rapidly follows. And one of the terms that's been associated with this low energy availability, what we call relative energy deficiency in sports, but it does apply to non-sports. It applies to those artistic gymnasts. It applies to the ballet dancers and many other environments as well. But critically, this relative energy deficiency in sports is now well recognised by governing bodies of many different sports. It's been part of a consensus statement within the International Olympic Committee, and you can find that and all the infographics at this British Association of Sports and Exercise Medicine site. And there's lots of great resources, a lot of them at this Red End Sport. Is another great site that I'd encourage you to go and seek more information if you're worried about your child not getting the energy for what they need. Kidsbacktosport.com is a website where parents and coaches and practitioners can go to get more information about how to keep kids injury free and how to get them safely back to sport when they're injured.